And of course, I want to welcome you to Shepherd Hill Regional High School for this very important meeting. I won't insult anybody's intelligence. We all know why we're here. This is a very important first step for us in what is going to be a very important year for our towns and for our school district. I'm Greg Desto, the superintendent of Dudley-Charlton, just entering my 4th year. For those of you who don't know me before that, I was the principal of Dudley Middle School for 10 years, assistant principal of Charlton Middle for 4, and a teacher in Worcester. That's relevant because I've said this before, the people in Dudley know my home is in Charlton, but my backyard is in Dudley, so I have done quite a bit of partying in Dudley in the backyard. But again, I welcome you, and I thank you very much for taking the time to be here on a weeknight. And if we could, let's just go around. I'll start with Robin, and we'll introduce ourselves and who we represent tonight, please.
Hi, I'm Robin Craver, the town administrator in Charlton.
Rich Matthew, finance director for the district.
Stephanie Lee, school committee for the Dudley-Charlton district.
Pauline O'Coy, school committee for the Dudley-Charlton. I'm on the Dudley side.
Catherine Cavallo, school committee from Dudley.
Elaine Rabbit, school committee from Charlton.
Mary Ann Tossi, school committee from Charlton.
Joanne Sevenak, treasurer collector, town of Charlton.
Jessica Lavrins, HR director for Charlton.
Jason Julian, Charlton Finance Committee.
John Gordalski, Charlton Finance Committee.
Henry Kamasi, Charlton Finance Committee.
Jerry Doble, Charlton Finance.
Donna Folio, Charlton Finance Director.
Keith Johnson, Charlton Finance Committee.
John McGrath, Charlton Board of Selectmen.
Maura O'Connor, Charlton Finance Committee.
David Singer, Charlton Selectmen.
Rich Carmignani, Dudley Treasurer Collector.
Michael Mayer, Dudley Finance Committee.
Stephen Sullivan, member of Board of Selectmen, Dudley.
John Marcy, Chairman, Dudley Board of Selectmen.
Greg Valiakonis, Dudley Town Administrator.
Deborah Noble, Charlton Board of Selectmen.
Mark Reel, District Director for Senator Ryan Fatman.
Joe Safarovich, Charlton Board of Selectmen.
Carol Broder, the Finance Committee from Charlton.
Mark Abrahams, the Abrahams Group.
Okay, thank you very much, and again, very much appreciate you being here. I had put on agenda item number 2, the purpose of the meeting, and it has since occurred to me very clearly that we really don't need to do that. I think that we all know that Mr. Abrahams is here to help us understand the numbers, why they are what they are, and that they are not likely to get any better in the near future anyway. So that's generally what we're probably going to hear tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Robin to be able to introduce Mark and get right into the most important part of the evening, which is his analysis.
Thank you. I think it is important to say a couple of things about how the analysis came to be, and I know that you're saying we all know, but it was a long year. So just for historical component, because we do have a lot of new faces here. We have almost a complete new finance committee for Charlton, so we're excited to have them here. Historically, we generally meet, have a kickoff in January to start our budget process. The town of Dudley officials, the town of Charlton officials, and Dudley-Charlton officials. And it seems like the last few years we've gotten together and we start this conversation, and there just never doesn't seem to be enough resources in the pot to fund all of the needs of the town's services and the school services. And we have conversations about how we can make changes, how we can do things, and then we're right up against town meeting, annual town meeting, and generally decide that there's not enough time to be able to plan or strategize or do something. So that happened again this year, and as you know, at least in Charlton, on the town meeting floor, the budget was opened, more was taken out of the savings account. People needed, I think at this time, what we need to do is to have a serious conversation about where we're going and try to do some projections. The Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee did have conversations after town meeting, and one of the things that they were very clear was we need to start having conversations earlier. We need to have accurate information, and we need to do this together. Hence, the Board of Selectmen and Finance Committee authorized Mark Abrams of Better Government to come in, take a look at the numbers, to try and put a presentation together for not only us, the elected officials who are trying to do, elected officials and finance people that are trying to make all of these services work, but also to have the answers so that when residents ask you, you know, what do you mean there's not enough money, or what do you mean that the school formula, or what do you mean that somebody pays more than somebody? You would have those answers. So Mark has put together a very lengthy, very comprehensive report for you at the request of the Charlton Board of Selectmen and Finance Committee. I appreciate and thank the school committee. We did ask you to help fund a portion of this, and you've agreed, so thank you very much for your input too. I can't tell you how excited I am to have Mark Abrams be doing this report. And he gave me, he says, who's introducing me? I said, probably me. And he gave me this list that, well, if I wasn't impressed before I looked at this to try and figure out what to tell you, I really am now. So I'm just going to tell you a few things that he's done so you can be, you know, a bit impressed as I was. So he is the CPA, he's the president of Abraham's Group, and his mission is to make governments better, thus the better government at AOL.com. To accomplish this, Mark teaches, consults, and writes about financial, operational, and performance management. With respect to Massachusetts ed reform, financing, accounting, and reporting, he has or is currently, he served as a consultant to the Foundation Budget Review Commission and co-authored the June 2001 report with Roger Hatch. He assisted the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to review its data collection and reporting requirements and co-authored the compliance supplement with Jay Sullivan. He's assisted several communities to implement integrated school municipal budget accounting and reporting systems, including the cities of Attleboro, Brockton, Chelsea, Gardner, Lowell, Malden, Newburyport, Newton, and Somerville, and the towns of Acton, Ashland, Framingham, Hopkinton, North Reading, Providencetown, Reading, Rockland, Shrewsbury. He's assisted several districts to understand net school spending and the foundation formula, including the towns of Ashland, Chatham, Dennis, Douglas, Holden, Hull, Lille, Lunenburg, Millis, Watertown, and Westford, the cities of Chicopee, Chelsea, Everett, Lawrence, Lowell, and New Bedford, and for regionals, the Amherst, Pelham, Berlin, Boylston, Dennis, Yarmouth, Dighton, Rehoboth, Martha's Vineyard, Northeast Metropolitan, and Up Island regions. I'm going to stop there, and I can tell you I'm only here of all of this. So he comes to us very qualified. I know him as someone who teaches school finance to town administrators and school business managers. He can answer your questions, and I just want to turn it over to you. And thank you for doing this for us. He's spent hours.
Well, thank you, and good evening. Good evening.
Good evening, Mark.
So let's get right into it. There's a lot of numbers here tonight. If I went through every number, we'd be here till after midnight. So what I want to do is present some big picture, high-level stuff. And there's plenty of finance committee people here. There's plenty of town finance officials here. We can provide you with all the backup and Excel spreadsheets that you would like. But I'm here to answer your questions. I'm here to present some I think, major financial issues for both towns and the region. So looking at the big picture, we're talking about a $49+ million budget. And on the left, you could see how it's broken up between the operating budget, transportation, and capital, the three main issues of the assessment methodology. If you look on the right, you'll see the same numbers but presented differently, and this is mostly by revenue. So there's this concept of a minimum local district contribution, and those are increasing each year, and those are set by the state, and it's the first part of your methodology for assessment. As we go through this, Dudley, your minimum is going to be increasing greater than Charlton's for reasons that we will get into. But Dudley, you need to understand that portion of the minimum. Number two, there's an excess of net school spending above the minimum, and each town is assessed that. So when the district comes up with its budget, most of the budget is eligible for net school spending. That's a technical term that we'll define tonight. Any net school spending greater than this minimum is assessed based on basically enrollment. And the enrollment is beginning to shift. The percent is becoming larger on Dudley than on Charlton. So part of the increases are A, the minimum, and B, the excess. Number 3, there's the transportation assessment, and number 4, there's the capital assessment. And you'll see that that's $20 million of the total regional budget. Then we have other revenues, Chapter 70, about half of the regional budget. And Chapter 70 is the state aid distribution to the region. That's going to be flat. It is not going to increase dramatically. In fact, it's pretty flat for the past several years. Then we have other revenue sources, excess and deficiency, Medicaid, transportation reimbursement, and others that you see there. Because Chapter 70 and net school spending constitute over 82% of your budget or your revenues, I want to spend some time with you explaining Chapter 70 and net school spending. Understand, you can't explain it. It is so complicated, but I've been doing this for a while and I think I can make it easier for you. So we're going to get into some state numbers, some Dudley-Charlton regional numbers, trends over the past several years. We're going to talk to you about foundation budget. I'm on slide 3. The foundation enrollment, local contributions, Chapter 70 aid, and required net school spending and actual net school spending. That will take a while. Then we're going to look at trends from a regional perspective over the past 10 or 11 years, to look at the required district contributions from both towns, to look at the excess of net school spending from both towns, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third part will be local capacity, revenues from the towns, historical look at that, and then some projections that were provided by Debbie and Dudley and Donna in Charlton. At the same time, the region would like to spend more money. We're going to show you numbers that shows that the region is the lowest per pupil spending of the 33 academics in this state. And then later we'll show you some numbers, or earlier, on net school spending, that they are one of, I think it's the second lowest in the state on net school spending. So from the regional point of view, the region is saying, we're doing okay here, but we would like to spend some more money. Why? Because we're the lowest in the state. From the two town perspectives, they're saying, we got limited revenues. And that's the stage for tonight. So from a key issue point of view, where I really want you to focus this evening, your assessments are increasing to both towns, taking more revenues from the two towns. Dudley and Charlton may not have the revenue base under Proposition 2.5 to sustain these assessments. And the actual spending is one of the lowest in the state, as I mentioned before. From a key terminology point of view, Chapter 70, net school spending, minimum local required contributions, actual net school spending from both the minimum contribution point of view and the excess. And then how does that fit into the assessment methodology for the minimum, for the excess, transportation, capital, and debt, and also local capacity. So we have a base minimum requirement that the state has set, that each town needs to meet, and each town has been meeting these requirements. We have the regional assessment. Again, the requirement, the excess, the transportation, and the capital. And the Chapter 70 minimum required contributions are increasing. Dudley's more than Charlton. And the excess of net school spending over the requirement is increasing, Again, Dudley's more than Charlton. So today's objectives are to understand the numbers, and then at the conclusion, discussion as to the next steps. So how many of you, when you got the packet, felt like this? Just a ton of numbers. So let's get some ground rules for tonight. As I go through this, if you have a question, please ask it, because many others might have the same question, and I'll do my best to answer. I might defer it to later when I have another slide that would answer the question more properly. So we have this term, required net school spending. It is the sum of your Chapter 70 aid and the local contributions that each town appropriates. And that required net school spending needs to be greater than or equal to this foundation budget. And I want to show you a chart, first at the state level and then second at the regional level, that puts a visual to these numbers. So we have a foundation budget. It's represented by this blue diagonal. At least on the screen it's blue. The darker blue is your Chapter 70 aid distributions. That's what you get from the state. This line is the actual net school spending. And the actual net school spending is basically even to the requirement. For the first 7 years of the foundation formula, the state was trying to get every district to this foundation budget, to this target, through a combination of Chapter 70, and your local contributions are basically this line above this darker line up to either the foundation budget or the requirement. And so it took the state 7 years to get everyone up to the foundation. Ed reform started in 1993 with about $1.2 billion in Chapter 70 aid. After 2000, the state said, okay, everybody's up to foundation. And for the next 7 years, they really didn't know what to do with the formula. By that time, many districts were analyzing this Chapter 70 and this foundation formula, and they were finding that districts of similar demographics, similar student enrollment, similar budgets were receiving vastly different Chapter 78. And so the state then analyzed it, and beginning in 2007 started to change the formula, where 2/3 of the districts were paying more than what the state said was their ability to pay. And you're going to see that in both Dudley and Charlton shortly. So the state began to change the calculation of the local district contributions and the townwide district contributions, and began to lower those contributions for each district that was above what the state said was their district's ability to pay, on the understanding that any district could pay whatever it wanted to for education, but the state was going to get out of the business of requiring districts to pay more than what the state said was their ability to pay. That began in 2007, and the state still hasn't resolved that issue. We're still trying to get to what I call, or the state calls, local contribution equity. This chart is backed up by a lot of figures, and if you had the Excel spreadsheet on this, if you unhide up here, you get all the data, this one for the state, all the way back to 1993. But let's look at some of the terms here. Foundation enrollment, foundation budget, required local contribution, Chapter 70 aid, required net school spending. actual net school spending and the dollars of actual spending that exceeds the requirement. So foundation enrollment, the definition is those are your students that live in your town that go to a public school. If they choice out or charter out, they're still your responsibility. They count towards your foundation enrollment. If they choice in to your district, then they belong to somebody else. The foundation budget is driven by two factors, the foundation enrollment and inflation. So you'll see here that there's been a decline in foundation enrollment statewide, but an increase in the foundation budget. And that's due primarily to the inflation factor. The required local contribution is calculated by the state, and we'll see how Charlton and Dudley's required local contribution are calculated. That number plus Chapter 70 aid gives you the required net school spending. And then you spend the minimum, you spend the excess, and then Rich prepares the end of the year report, sends it into the state, and the state computes your actual net school spending, and then compares it to the requirement. And when Rich submits your end of the year report, he's submitting the actual plus next year's budget. So the state has from the district the information they need to validate whether your budget meets the requirement and whether your actuals meet the requirement. And then over here, we compare the actual spending, net school spending, to the requirement. So statewide, the foundation enrollment is generally declining. The foundation budget, the required and actual net school spending are all increasing, and the statewide average of the excess of the actual net school spending over the requirement is 23%. Keep that number in mind. Let's look at the region. Slide 13. You're getting far more in Chapter 70 aid than the average of other districts. That said, the Chapter 70 aid grew as districts were getting to foundation, kept on growing, but look at this. It's really leveled off over the last several years. Your foundation budget has been increasing, took a little dip here, so it's been slightly under, basically due to enrollment drops and very low or negative inflation. See this dotted line? This is the requirement. And this solid line is the actual. So a couple of takeaways from this slide. One, you're getting far more Chapter 70 aid as a district, as a region, than most districts in the state. Number two, your actual net school spending is very close to the requirement. And if you look at the numbers that support this, this is for the region now. Your foundation enrollment is declining. Your foundation budget is growing. Your required local contribution, your Chapter 70 aid is growing. Your required net school spending and actual net school spending is growing. But the excess of the actual over the requirement is 4.4%. Statewide average, 23%. So your foundation enrollment over the last 10 years or 11 years has declined about 10%. Foundation budget has increased about 16%. Local contribution increases 51%. Chapter 70 aid increased 22% over that time, and required and actual net school spending increased 22% over that time. Questions so far? So how does this Chapter 70 formula work? It's well in excess of $4 billion. So the statewide foundation budget is over $10 billion, and 41% of that is funded by Chapter 70 aid, and 59% is funded by local districts. So roughly $4+ billion for state aid and roughly $6.1 billion for local contributions. The local contributions are based on two tests. One is wealth, and one is what we call the 82.5% rule. So the 59% local contribution, wealth-based, is based on your EQV, equalized valuation, and your aggregate income. EQV is computed first by your assessors sending in the valuations to DOR. Department of Revenue then takes it, and because there was a 3-year cycle, now a 5-year cycle, they equalize those cycles, and thus the term equalized valuation. So half of the local contributions is based on EQV, and the other half is by the income taxes received from each community. And this is 50-50 statewide. It's not 50-50 individual districts. But if you look at it statewide, it's 50-50. So let's start with the foundation budget. This is the target of spending defined by the Education Reform Act. And you'll see there are categories over here on the left, and here is the district's foundation enrollment going across the top. The foundation enrollment is by grade levels, and the state has developed more formulas that for each grade level there are dollar values for each foundation line item. This is based on a 1993 formula, inflated by inflation since 1993, and really has no relationship to reality. But it's consistent district to district to district. And it is the target of spending that all districts must maintain through local contributions and what the state calls foundation aid. And we'll show you that shortly. So each district has a foundation budget. Dudley-Charlton has one similarly. This slide shows you the Chapter 70 aid. Basically, the Chapter 70 aid for 18 is based on, first, what did the state give you last year? The state gave you $24.1 million. Then it takes the foundation budget, subtracts the two towns' contribution to Dudley-Charlton, and comes up with a term called foundation aid. The state must fund foundation aid to meet its commitment to keep all districts at foundation. So the sum of your local contributions, $16 million, plus the state aid of $21 million, gets you to the district's foundation budget of $37 million. Okay, so foundation aid, they're going to give you $21 million. How much did they give you last year? $24 million. So they're not going to give you more foundation aid, because what they gave you last year was more than what you need foundation aid this year. It's a grandfathering. But since the state wants to give districts more money, they give you minimum aid, which is $30 for each of your foundation enrollment. So you got the base aid of $24 million and $114,000 in minimum aid to give you the $24.2 million Chapter 70 aid for fiscal 18. So again, your base aid exceeds your foundation aid, and because of that, you get minimum aid. And I can't stress enough that this base aid exceeding the foundation aid is a lot, 2.5 million, and that is susceptible. The state could come back and say, look, we're giving you more in base aid than what we should be giving you in foundation aid. So just hold that thought and hope that day never comes. The story here is that Chapter 70 aid is not the cavalry. It's not going to come in and solve additional revenue needs for the district. And when we get to our projections, we're going to reinforce that idea. So think of it. You have a less than 1% increase from the state in Chapter 78. Compare the numbers to last year. Foundation enrollment, foundation budget, required district contribution, Chapter 78, and required net school spending. A decline in enrollment, a slight increase in foundation budget, over a $500,000 increase in local contribution, and only $114,000 from the state. Add the 576 or 578 and the 114, you get the required net school spending increase. So your enrollment as a region is declining. The foundation budget increased only 0.6%. The contributions went up almost 4%. Chapter 70 increased 0.4%. So let's talk local contributions. And I said earlier, the state wants every district to pay what the state determines to be their ability to pay. So on the left is how the state determines ability to pay, and on the right is where are you toward that ability to pay. And I said earlier that 50% comes from EQV and 50% comes from income. Well, we all know that EQV is far greater than income. So to achieve 50%, we need a deflator for the EQV and an inflator for the income. And we're not quite at 50%, 5.2 million versus 6.3 million. But we take the EQV effort and the income effort, and we get to this concept called combined effort yield, 11.6 million. That's one test to determine, in this case, how much Charlton should pay toward education as a minimum requirement. The second test is the state is promising every district 17.5% of foundation to be paid by Chapter 70. No matter how wealthy a community is, every district is guaranteed to have 17.5% of foundation paid by the state. So the second test is to take the foundation budget, take 82.5%, and that comes to 18.6 million. And the state takes the lower of the two. 11.6 is lower than 18.6, so Charlton needs to, as a minimum, pay 11.6 as its target for its local effort. Do some percentages here, you get a target share of roughly 52% and a state Chapter 70 share of 48%. So that's Charlton's target, 11.6 million. Where is Charlton? Well, last year they contributed 11.4. Every district's last year's contribution is increased by what is called a municipal revenue growth factor, on the theory that schools should share in municipal growth. That growth factor is 3.18, which raises the contribution from 11.4 to 11.8. And that's at 52.48%. The target is lower than that, so there is an excess of 179,000. That excess is reduced to get closer to the effort. If that reduction was 100%, we'd be at full equity. The state's been trying to get to full equity since 2007. So they reduce it by 85%, they reduce the excess, and Charlton is to pay 11.7 million, still higher than their effort of 11.6, but closer. So 2 or 3 takeaways. Charlton has a required townwide contribution of 11.6. It's slightly higher than their target share. So next year, assuming the formula doesn't change, you can project what Charlton will be paying as a local contribution.
Mark, I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
Where does the municipal revenue growth factor come from, and how do we compare to other communities at 3.18 and 5.4?
Okay, so the growth factor is 3.18%. It's computed by DOR, Department of Revenue. There is a sheet that we can send you. There is a website at DOR that you can see this. It's basically 3 components. Property taxes, 2.5, new growth, which is a rolling 4-year average. Number 2 is certain state aid, which has been basically flat. And number 3 are your municipal revenues, non-enterprise, recurring municipal revenues. You put that into their formula, and out comes a 3.18, which I believe is slightly lower than the statewide average. So Greg, we can get you that spreadsheet if you would like. And there's one for every municipal district. The formula is a municipal formula. Regional districts are pulled together from municipalities. Okay, so we've got 11.6 million, 11.7 from Charlton, but Charlton belongs to more than one regional district. So how does Dudley-Charlton receive its share of that 11.7 million? And you'll see another spreadsheet here, but here's the 11.7 million. And basically, to keep this simple, each municipality pays a local district contribution to the regions to which it belongs, based on its share of the regional foundation budget. So here we've got the regional foundation budget, and Charlton's share of Dudley-Charlton is 87.89%. Multiply the townwide contribution by 87.89, you get the required district contribution that Charlton pays to Dudley-Charlton. And Charlton belongs to Southern Worcester, and so Charlton gets a required district contribution for them as well. That 10.2, 10.3 million is then added to Dudley's to get to the 2 towns' required contributions to the region. So, I skipped over Dudley, I'm sorry.
The number that's just under the town name alone, that's 3 of are those students that are in, that's not Bay Path, that's students that are in.
Rich, which, is that the Aggie or?
I would tend to think it's the
This is the Aggie
The
students?
agricultural,
Okay.
right. Right. All right, on Dudley, same format. On the left, we've got, now I'm on slide 19, we've got the calculation of Dudley's ability to pay, and on its right, we've got the Dudley contribution. So again, the wealth factors, the EQV on top, the income in the middle, combined effort yield is 7.6. Again, not quite 50-50. A combined effort yield of 7.7 million. The foundation budget at 19.8, 82.5% is 16 million plus. 7.7 million is less than 16 million. So like Charlton, Dudley's target is based on its wealth factors, not the 82.5%. And then you'll see that Dudley's share for its contribution to its foundation budget is 39%, and the state 61%. Where is Dudley? Last year, Dudley contributed 6 million plus, which is about 1.6 million below its local effort target. Dudley's growth factor is higher than Charlton, higher than the statewide average, gets you to a preliminary of 6.4, which is 1.2 million below its target. So there's a shortfall of almost 7%. So in addition to the municipal revenue growth factor increase, districts that are between 2.5 and 7.5% short, and Dudley is in that range, pay an additional 1% increment. So you'll see an increase here for the growth factor, an increase here for the increment, gets Dudley to 6.4, 6.5 million, still 1.1 million below its target. So what the state is saying is, based on the wealth factors, Dudley's target local effort should be 6.6 million. Dudley's actual, even with the growth factor and the increment, is still 1.2 million below its targeted local effort. If nothing changes in the formula, we can expect the same for next year, that Dudley will be below. And so Dudley feels the pressure here of added increments because it's below its target. Similarly, Dudley's $6.4 million contribution townwide is split between its regions, and Dudley-Charlton receives $5.8 million from Dudley as its regional district contribution. Questions so far? Yes.
Oh, no.
Hi.
I'm thinking.
You're straight, all right. Yes.
I do have a question. So what controls the minimum assessment then is that effort goal for the equalized valuation and the income?
Yes.
So those numbers, they're supposed to be 50-50, but they're not. They're significantly off.
50-50 statewide.
Okay, so it's just
Right.
for the town. So they,
right.
okay.
Come on, there's got to be other questions. Okay. So, hard to read because all the numbers come together, but on slide 23, this is how the region gets put together. So finance types, we got a spreadsheet that has Dudley's computation on Excel, Charlton's computation on Excel. You could see all the formulas that the state has in determining these individual numbers, and then a spreadsheet that pulls them all together as one region. And so you come down to here, I mean, you can compare the EQVs, the income, and I should say that the EQV is based on 2016. It's updated every other year. And the income is based on 2015. It's updated every year, but there's a lag in both EQV and income data from DOR. So this pulls the region together. And here is a summary. And the foundation enrollment from the two towns, the foundation budgets, the required district contributions, Chapter 70 aid, and we're back to the 40.3, 40.4 required net school spending of the $49 million, $50 million regional budget. So I just want to talk about this equity concept. First, local equity. When the provisions went into effect in 2007, you could see if this is equity, the line for equity, look at the number of districts that were above the line, meaning their contributions were greater than what the state said was those districts' ability to pay. And similarly, look at the number of districts below whose contributions were less than what the state said was their ability to pay. 2007, 12 years later, they've cleaned up those districts that were above, like Charlton, but Charlton still has, you know, a little bump here. And they're getting better for the districts that are below their effort, like Dudley. But Dudley is still, what do we say, 1.1, 1.2 million below its effort. When the state came up with this concept of this equity, they felt for these districts below their effort that the municipal growth factor would take care of that, that over time, those districts would get up to their effort. But they realized 5 years ago that wasn't the case, so they began to introduce these increments. And they may continue those increments. And again, Dudley, you're going to see those increments for the next several years. On state aid equity, 2007, a lot of districts receiving more Chapter 70 base aid than their foundation aid. But look at the number of districts who are receiving less. I live in Framingham. Framingham was about the most abused that didn't receive its full share of state aid Chapter 70 funds. The state has cleaned that up. But look at all the districts like you're 2.5 million above foundation aid. You're in with a lot of company. So yes, it is susceptible, but there are, 86% of all districts receiving more Chapter 70 aid, base aid, than their foundation aid. Sir?
Can you explain and clarify the axes? So Chapter 70, 8% versus target 8%, what does that mean?
Okay, so this is the Chapter 70 aid target for each district. Many above receiving more Chapter 70 aid than foundation aid, many below not receiving in base aid what it should be in foundation aid. Cleaned it up a lot.
But the scattering either way, above and below that line, is just the basics, like the differences in towns' incomes, towns.
No. What we're talking about here is, for example, you're about 2.5 million above. Groton Dunstable is like 7 million above. So you're going to see some higher, and you're probably right around the middle here.
Is what you're asking, what is the rhyme or reason for why somebody would be, for example, 7 million above as opposed to 2 million above, in a nutshell?
Prior inequities. Chapter 78, I don't know when it started. It was at 1.2 billion in 1993 when ed reform started. So we had inequities in state aid distributions, inequities in local contributions, and the state's trying to deal with both, but they haven't made too much progress on state aid equity.
So your point earlier, Mark, was that while if you're 2.5 million above, in theory, that is susceptible because they don't have to give us that extra 2.5. We're kind of grandfathered into that. However, you're kind of loosely making the point that if 87% of districts are above, that would be an awfully big political piece of dynamite.
Right. So let me give you a practical example that's coming up in a few more slides. Foundation Budget Review Commission issued their report in 2016 that the fringe benefits and SPED are woefully underfunded in the foundation budget. School committee, you would agree with that. Okay, everybody would agree with that. It's about $1 billion underfunded. Okay, so how does the state gonna fund this? 59% from local contributions, 41% from Chapter 78. Where is the state gonna come up with $4.1 billion to fund the Foundation Budget Review Commission's recommendations? Okay, so new Chapter 78, that's going to be hard to do given the economies that they're facing. Well, what about this excess of Chapter 70 base aid over foundation aid? That's where susceptibility starts to raise its question. But again, as Greg pointed out, 86% of the districts are above. So that's going to be a hard political sell by the state. I'm just saying, be aware. So eventually, you'll be at equity. That is, local contribution equity. And what will that look like? Hardly a difference. You will receive no additional Chapter 70 aid. Why? Because you're 2.5 million above the foundation aid, and your local district contributions will be reduced by 24,000 combined. So you're almost at equity for the local contributions. So you must spend the required net school spending of $40.3 million, which is greater than your $38 million foundation budget. You are spending more than the foundation budget. Your actual net school spending was slightly north of $41 million. This includes the excess of net school spending greater than the requirement, but this does not include transportation or debt or capital. That's 4.4% over the requirement. Statewide average is 23%. On a per pupil basis, 33 of the 33 two-town academic regions fiscal 16 per pupil spending, you are the lowest at 11.7 thousand. The state average is $15,164. Most districts spend well above the requirement. So you're at 104.4. You're in about a category with 38 other districts. And you could see the spread. Not too many are spending below you, and a lot more are spending well above you. And here are the numbers relative to the 33 districts.
Mark, can I make a point?
Please.
Can I go to the blackboard?
Sure.
Okay.
You are a former teacher, right?
So the first thing I did when I looked at this was I said, oh my God, we're on the same chart with Concord, Carlisle, and Lincoln, Sudbury, and we can't be on the same chart with those guys. But if we were just to be where Freetown Lakeville is, it's approximately $900 more per pupil. That would be another $3.6 million to our budget. That's how far behind we are. So we're not really comparing ourselves to those wealthy districts. We're just comparing ourselves to the ones that are somewhat similar.
Well, when I first started this, we had all the districts. Then we just focused on the regional districts. Then we took out the vocational schools. Then we had academic districts, 33 of them, but this is just the two-town academic districts. So we kind of jettisoned it down to very similar type regional academic two town districts.
And if I can add, jettison down each one of those categories, we were still the lowest at the bottom.
Yes.
So, were we the lowest in the state in general?
No. We were, what?
Third from the lowest.
Third from the lowest overall.
So we're pretty much in the bottom.
We're the Cleveland Browns, Jerry. No, but,
We were in the bronze medal.
and I may be oversimplifying it, but I think this gets to one of the hearts of the matter. There are several hearts to this matter. That we are, as this analysis shows, very low, but at the same time, our towns are maxed out with what they can give us. So it isn't, it's like we're all stretched to the max, and that's really one of the key points that I think we need to pull away from tonight.
So this is per pupil. The next slide is the actual spending. And we saw the numbers earlier, the 104% compared to the 123% statewide average. So we took the actual net school spending and then put it on a per pupil basis. And you're the lowest at 10 million, right, $10,200 plus. These are state numbers. State per pupil expenditures, state actual net school spending numbers, again, for the two-town academic regions. And I mentioned earlier the Foundation Budget Review Commission. The report was published in fiscal 16. Don't have to go over this because I made the point earlier. But again, if it took 7 years to implement, to get each district up to foundation originally, then I would think the Foundation Budget Review Commission's recommendations would also be implemented over a time frame. Not clear what that time frame would be. Fiscal 18 numbers included 15% of the Foundation Budget Review Commission's recommendations. So, Chapter 70, net school spending, constitutes about 40 million of your $50 million. Questions on that? Clarifications on that? All right, the next set of slides basically takes a lot of the Chapter 70 numbers, net school spending numbers, local contribution numbers, enrollment numbers, foundation budget numbers, and trends them over time. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this section, but you can now visually see these numbers. So foundation enrollment, we said it was declining. This gives you a visual. Your foundation budget, required net school spending, pretty flat over these years. Required local contribution, Chapter 78, pretty flat over the years. The trends in Chapter 78, the components of it. Foundation enrollment, you can see Charlton's declining and Dudley's pretty flat. So think of your assessment methodology, and the excess of net school spending greater than the requirement is assessed on the percent of student enrollment. So as Charlton's enrollment continues to decline, Dudley picks up more of that piece of the assessment. Foundation budget per pupil, both towns almost identical. EQV per pupil trending along the same line, Charlton higher than Dudley. Income per pupil trending along the same line with one blip. Target local share trending along the same line. and the reciprocal, the distance from target local share. Comparing the growth factors, pretty close, a bigger jump in 17. The required local contributions, the target state aid share, and as I said earlier, look at how flat Chapter 70 is. Now, the minimum aid has ranged from $20 to $55 over the last, I don't know, 10, 12 years. But it's not much, and it's not going to really help you going forward. So Rich and I then took our spreadsheets and started to look, what could we present to you in terms of a 5-year projection? Where are the local district contributions going to go? That is, of your townwide contribution, that which you give from Dudley and from Charlton to the region. Dudley's is nearly going to double Charlton's increase. Why? The minimum is below the target, and as Charlton's enrollment declines, Dudley picks up bigger percentage of the excess in the assessment methodology. But Dudley will reach its target by the year 2023. That's the last year of our projection. Chapter 70 will be flat. Whether it's $20, $30, $55, we don't know. But it's going to be around that $114,000 figure going forward.
Mark, can I make a quick point?
Yeah.
We look at, as a district, we look at essentially revenue from the state, Chapter 70 being one of them, and Mark's covering that in great depth tonight. The other one is regional transportation funding that we only get because we're a regional district. And that has ranged in the years that I've been paying attention to it from approximately the very high 50s, 60%, all the way to 72%, somewhere in there. So when we combine what we get and the additional, so if they give us, say, $20 per pupil more, so that's whatever that comes out to, $100,000 or whatever. And then if transportation is reduced, we've got to factor that in too. So I think this year our increase from the state ended up being something like $36,000. Is that accurate, Rich?
Seems close, yeah.
So that's just the point I wanted to make from the world that we live in, which is in some ways similar to things that you deal with too. Thanks.
So funding for the region, basically 85% from the assessments and 15% from Chapter 78. So what we tried to do was, in the next several slides, deal with the district's operating budget. What would a 3% increase look like to the regional budget, recognizing that in 18 the increase was 2.14%? And so the operating budget, what would Chapter 70 look like? We know it's flat. District resources, the Charlton minimum, we projected that for the next 5 years. The Dudley minimum, we projected that for the next 5 years, knowing that Dudley's minimum is going to be, the increase is going to be greater than the increase in Charlton. Then the excess of net school spending, greater than the requirement. And given the enrollment decline, we estimated a what, Rich, 1%? Half a percent shift. So this presents A, the Chapter 70, B, the Charlton and Dudley minimum, C, the Charlton and Dudley excess over the minimum, Transportation. The Chapter 71 reimbursement, and then the Charlton and Dudley assessment for transportation. And then on the bottom, summarizing it. So Charlton's minimum, Charlton's additional, i.e. the excess of net school spending greater than the minimum. Transportation. And the increases going from 5.3% and then running out about 4.3 to 4.5%, 19 through 23. Dudley, the minimum increasing, the additional increasing, its share of transportation. So Dudley's increases 11% fiscal 19, and then 9.2, 8.5, 8.2, 7.5. And this is exclusive of capital and debt. So some increases coming, Dudley's higher increases than Charlton.
I'd just like to make a point to everybody. I used a 3% increase on the transportation budget, but our contract is up this year, so I'll be putting a bid out. So we have no idea what the actual number will be until we get that bid back. And it may be, an outrageous increase the first year and then, normalized increases afterwards. We just don't know. Sometimes when you go out to bid, you can get pretty close, and we have had a long relationship with our current vendor, but you never do know. So we're using an estimate from where we are today, but the contract is up, and that's an important piece for everybody to know.
And I also want to point out that the district is not saying they're going to increase their budget by 3%. This is what would the numbers be if, and then 3% was selected. Fair to say?
Yes, that's fair to say.
And 3% is on the whole budget, not 3% on what we've been paying.
Right. So, with that, let's look at local revenues. And we looked at it from a couple of points. So the tax rates in Charlton and Dudley, and the increases over the last 5, 6 years. Greg, I think you have one of the lowest tax rates in the state.
Yep.
Am I correct on that?
For full-service community, yeah.
Excess levy capacity. So can we turn to the tax levy and tax more? And you'll see very limited excess capacity, not just in 17, but in the last several years. What about free cash? So there's some fluctuation in free cash. What about stabilization? So at that point, we turn to the town accountants and finance directors and ask them if they would do a forecast. A on revenues for both towns. And basically, I mean, there's a lot of numbers here. But 2.5 is basically 2.5 of the prior year's levy plus new growth. And then other revenues, at best, were projected at 2%. So Donna from Charlton developed this template. It's based on the recap sheet. And then Debbie filled in the numbers. Admittedly, we've got to fine-tune this for the the local district minimum contributions. But if the towns are at 2.5% plus new growth for taxes and 2% at best for other revenue sources, and the what if at 3%, the math doesn't work. So we've got a couple of slides on Charlton's revenue forecast and a couple of slides on Dudley's revenue forecast. Each one for revenues, one for expenditures. So in summary, one of today's objectives was to understand the numbers, and we presented a ton of numbers to you tonight. From the regional perspective, the per pupil spending is the lowest of the 33 two-town academic regions. The actual net school spending is the lower 20% of all districts. The regional costs are rising. Assessments are increasing. The region would like to budget more, not just a want of the district, but in their view, what is needed to keep pace with a continuing increase in educational costs and expectations. From the local perspective, the two towns are challenged to maintain current foundation, current assessments. Dudley is under its local effort. Its minimum local required contributions will be increasing nearly double that of Charlton's increase. And Dudley is going to absorb more of the excess of net school spending due to the enrollment shifts. And the two towns have limited revenue capacity. Charlton slightly more than Dudley. So second objective of today is determine where to go from here. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.